Good afternoon, Ms. Aisha. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Yeah, good afternoon. How
Yes,
are you?
thank you so much. I'm fine. So I think it's time to begin now. We have some of our speakers here
Okay.
physically. So when you want to introduce them, they will come on. They will come on board.
Okay, let me start with welcoming Sam Daly from University of Chicago. Do we have Junaid Danladi?
Yes, he's here with us
from
present.
Bayero University, Sokoto? And
Yes.
Bayero University, NYC. Zayun Deng from Shanghai,
Yes, I'm here.
Noma University.
Yes, I'm
Then
here.
Abdul Basit Kasim from Stanford University.
Dr. Abdul Basit is yet to join us.
Okay, you are welcome to our session, Engaging the Readers, on a book titled Entangled Domains, Empire, Law and Religion in Northern Nigeria, a book authored by Rabiat Akande, which was published by Cambridge University Press, 2023. So I would like to first of all know if the author is around.
Yes, she's here with us, ma'am.
Okay. If it will be okay, maybe we give ourselves 5 minutes. Is 5 minutes okay for discussants to be able to go through their own synopsis of what the book entails? Let me start by saying, as the chairperson of this session, let me start by commending the author. Entangled Domains, Empire, Law, and Religion in Northern Nigeria, I can say, is a fresh insight into legal historical study of colonial and post-colonial governance in Northern Nigeria. And the focus of that book is on the interaction between religion, law, and the colonial states. What I saw reading through the book is that the author engages readers with a conventional understanding, try to challenge our understanding of what we mean by secularism. And it also reveals colonial secular governance define and religion. I can see in the book that it demonstrates that the entanglement of law and religion, it has even gone beyond, in her discussion, it goes beyond colonial, it goes beyond post-colonial period, especially with the crisis we're having in Northern Nigeria with regard to the issue of Sharia implementation. Insights, but notwithstanding, there are some shortcomings I can say, if I may point out. The author dwells so much on considering the voices of the elites, ignoring the substantial voice that is the voices of the masses. You know, we say religion is the opium of the masses. From accounts of notwithstanding, I can say the author has done a very wonderful work by demonstrating for a wonderful. I will allow my colleagues, other discussants, to also present their own perspectives from the book. Yes,
Shall I
Let me
start?
see whose hand is up.
Do you want to call the discussant alphabetically, or you just want to call them randomly, ma?
Let's start with those who indicate interest that want to speak now. See, is Sikiru guiding us?
Yes, we can hear you, ma.
Okay, let me start with Sam.
Okay, great.
Yes, Sam, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for having me here today and for giving me the opportunity about this fantastic book. It is, I think, one of the most important books published in African legal history in recent years, and it deserves a wide audience. So, if you haven't read it already, I really encourage you to do so. It is detailed in its treatment of the inner workings of Nigerian colonial and post-colonial history,
Sam, we
but
can
it has
hear you.
much larger claims. Oh, not at
We can
all?
hear you clearly.
How about,
Yes, we can hear you.
is
Yes.
that better? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, thank you very much for having me here and for allowing me to speak about this really fantastic book, which I want to start by saying is I think one of the most important books in African legal history to be published in recent years. It is a very detailed, very rigorous treatment of Nigeria's colonial and post-colonial history, but it's also a book with really big ideas that are portable to other contexts and other places. So if you haven't read it already, I really encourage you to do so, uh, where your interests lie in history. Akande shows us that there was a paradox at the very center of British colonial administration in Nigeria. The British Empire justified its presence there and its existence by saying that it backed no favorite in the station for souls that was going on in the empire between Christians and Muslims and practitioners of indigenous religions. And the tepid Anglicanism that animated British rule at home in the British Isles was by and large not brought into imperial spaces, including northern Nigeria. This is what the British said about themselves. But at the same time, as we all know, one of the main animating principles of British colonial rule in Nigeria was this thing called indirect philosophy associated with guard of leaving in place existing structures of authority as much as possible, almost like preserving them under glass in order to create an administrative system that was stable and that was not likely to provoke revolt. Those two ideas were antithetical because many of those indigenous institutions, or indigenous institutions, which were really in many ways constructed by the British, uh, very much fused religious and political authority in a way that was distinctly non-secular. So Akande's first insight is to show us this paradox. And rather than trying to resolve it, she shows us that that paradox was in Algiers secularism. And this is about the people who come to Nigeria. When people debate secularism, it often isn't clear what exactly they're debating. Are they debating the pure theory of the thing, the principle that governance and religion ought to live in separate rooms? Or are they pitting religions against each other? Are they using this debate about secularism as a cover for something else? Akande shows us that actually both of these views are too simplistic. Now she's writing on top of a literature that is dominated by people like Talal Asad and Saba Mahmoud, who have argued that secularism is something to critique on a lot of different grounds. First and foremost, because it is connected to the European Enlightenment and is much less agnostic or ecumenical in its form than it claims to be. That's all well and good, but Akande is not particularly interested in those debates. She's interested in something deeper and more specific to the Nigerian context. When people debate secularism here, she shows us, very often they are debating not theology, not necessarily politics. They're having a debate about history and a legal historian's view that makes this clear. So the second big innovation of this work that I want to note is how Akande treats secularism as a legal problem. She writes at some point that secularism is like all legal ideas in that it has internal contradictions and, quote, competing external deployments. Now, that is not how most people would see secularism or how they would approach it. And yet, approaching it as a legal problem, as Akande does, reveals a lot about it. It also takes down the temperature of the debate, which I think is very important. As we all know, the debate about secularism in northern Nigeria has been very acrimonious, very fractious. And Akande does not have any interest in adding fuel to the fire. Quite the opposite. She gives us a way of understanding the state and the politics that are behind it that is much more sick, and a lot less to identity, which I think is actually a very valuable thing. The debate that she shows is actually this kind of old administrative debate about what form of politics serve the task administration best. Indirect rule, placing existing authorities with something on the model. This debate is, of course, very present in lots of different areas of Nigerian politics, not just relevant to secularism. But she shows us when we'll have these fiery debates about secularism, very often what they're talking about is something more like debating Lugard and Cameron, which is an interesting and important corrective, I think, to the way that this is talked about in Nigeria, and elsewhere. Okay, I'll leave it there, but I just want to end by congratulating Akande on creating this fantastic book and sharing it with us. It really is a pleasure to talk about it.
Thank you, Sam. Dan, can we have your own voice?
Sure, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Can people on site hear me clearly?
Yes, we can hear
Secure?
you. Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, great. I'll start. Thank you for having me here as well. It's really a very great opportunity for me to read this book and to learn from the author here today at LSA. To be honest, I'm not an expert of legal history, not an expert of Islam in northern Nigeria. I just finished my PhD last year on the history of the Ahmadiyya in Nigeria, which is mostly focused on the southwest part of the country. So I'm really looking forward to this opportunity to learn from the author and other discussants. So Sam has brilliantly summarized this wonderful book, and I think I won't repeat what he has said about this, the paradox in colonial or imperial secular governmentality, and the very important point of the debate on secular and religion, uh, following the trade of Talal Assad and Sabah Mahmoud and other scholars. I want to point out that a few minor points maybe that I found very fascinating to me, other than those I have Sam has pointed out. I think one thing is that the author Akande was mentioning about these debates of the secular was not in the post-colonial Nigeria was not a kind of to I think he was using the word that it was an using the Spivak's word, a part of an unfinished nature of the past. She did not use the debate of secular in the post-colonial Nigeria to as a way that people mobilize the past to serve the present, but rather to see this in a continuum, to see the debates of the secular or the Sharia law or the religious the entanglement of religion and politics as part of unfinished business, unfinished nature since the colonial past. I think that's also very important because nowadays we are emphasizing more and more about we are questioning about the division between colonial and post-colonial. While I think this book also gives us a very example to see the connections between the colonial period and so-called colonial period and the post-colonial period. That's a point I want to emphasize here. And then there is, yeah, I will finish here. I think give the floor to the next speaker, and we can have more questions, uh, I think afterwards.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. Thank you for your voice.
Thank you.
Can we go to Abdul Basit, my son? Hello, Abdul Basit. Abdul Basit.
Yes, I'm there. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Thank you.
Oh, okay. It's so nice to see you again, Professor
Yeah.
Aisha Bal.
Yes, thank
Jazakallah
you.
khairan. It's so
Good
nice
to
to see
see
you,
you.
man.
Yes.
So I will start by, oh, I think, okay. So I will start by first and foremost congratulating Dr. Rabiat Akande for writing this masterful piece. I personally learned a lot from this book. And this book is, it has set a very high pedestal for scholarship on Northern Nigerian Islam, but also scholarship on legal history, especially within the African context in general. What I'm actually going to do in this review, I'm going to give like a brief synopsis of what I understood from the book, and then I will end by posing questions to Dr. Rabiat Akande. So the question of secularism, is Nigeria a secular state? Is a question that has plagued the post-colonial Nigerian states. And in this book, Dr. Rabiat, she actually traced the genealogy of the secularizing project that has become the hallmark of the Nigerian states. This genealogy for her started with the fall of Darul Islam in 1903. So the frequency of intra-emirate rebellion and riveting contest over power, succession disputes that often degenerated into civil wars, and unceasing external encroachment by African warlords and European powers were causative factors that provided the social and political grounds for the occupation of Hausa land and Borno, which became northern Nigeria. As the political fabric of the caliphate and emirates began to fall apart, the traditional ruling elite and the ulama developed a great variety of responses. These responses were the subject of Professor Mohammed Sani Umar's dissertation, which later became a book. And I think Dr. Rabiat Akande is building on that tradition as well. When resistance against the British conquest failed, some Muslim rulers undertook strategic withdrawal in the form of the famous Hijra to the east. At the same time, others like Wazir Buhari, who wrote Risalatu ila al-Hilmi wa Tadabbur, they justify through their writings the decision to live and work as Muslims under British colonial rule. This particular decision was premised upon the fact that there's going to be non-interference in the day-to-day daily conduct of Muslim practices, which Dr. Rabiat Akande also spoke about in a book. By 1906, many of those in positions of power who were selected as nominees and proteges of the British to replace the deposed ruling elite. They developed a vested interest in the stability and continuation of the new colonial order. The school system was transformed by the new schools established by the Christian missionaries. New methods of administration based on the appropriate existing political structures were adopted. Sharia replaced, supplement, and it was modified by other laws based on European codes. A series of imperial decrees were introduced that replaced the theocratic precept of Islamic governance with a direct rule system. In a book, Dr. Rabiat draws our attention colonial technique defining, deepening, and creating hierarchy of religious differences based on an ontological fixation and valorization of differences as a means of maximizing disparities. The social, economic, and political development following the decline of the pre-colonial Islamic Caliphate and Emirates in northern Nigeria and the beginning of the European colonial power had a profound impact on both the colonized culture as well as the colonizer. The changes were reflected in normative aspect, underlining the process of colonization and the construction of the cultural order. This process of ordering had different purposes. The order was great and is generating identity in a specific conquest. Ultimately, the purpose was control. In a book, Secondly, she drew our attention to this construction of hierarchy of religious differences, which was followed by purification discourses, which eventually culminated in the idea that northern Nigeria or the region that will live in northern Nigeria could be only by indirect rule. And direct rule, the policy emulating the colonial. Okay. But at the same time, the agents of colonial power, they were also clearly emulating the pre-colonial caliphate structure, at least during the Lugardin years before Donald Cameron, as Dr. Rabiat explained in a book. They were carrying out cultural mimicry, appropriating, appreciating, and absorbing local reformist discourses, which help create their own identities. With the increasing influx of Christian missionaries, the colonialists moved towards the semantics of traditionalizing the colony, thereby introducing the policy of civilizing mission and modernization. Modernizing the colony required vast and detailed information about the subject and its processes. In doing so, Northern Nigeria, as Dr. Rabiat-Akande argued, Northern Nigerian society became to be communalized, Muslim and pagan communities becoming two monolithic actors in colonial memory. Different reforms and juridical changes had repercussions on secular governmentality. The massive restructuring of society produced new societal formations with new social needs and new forms of articulation and discontent. This discontent in the work of Dr. Rabiat-Akande was exemplified in the works of the missionaries and their evangelizing projects, as well as in the local political elite who inherited the caliphate structure. Now, having discussed the general synopsis or the idea that my major takeaways from the book, I would love to actually ask. So one of the things I also did while reading the book as well, I went back to the reference to the bibliography. Look at who are the scholars the rabbis are engaging in their work. I mean, because the bibliography gives me a sense of the canon, the archive, the semantic world that she is actually engaging knowledge from. And what I noticed in the bibliography on the reference, I noticed a significant gap and a lacuna, which I would love to point attention to. And this lacuna is also something common in modern, like Western academic literature on Northern Nigeria. Now, there are several like historiographical traditions that emerged in Northern Nigeria. The first historiographical tradition that emerged were the writings and the travel literature of the Arab explorers. The second historiographical literature were the Kinglies, the chronicles, and indigenous Arabic sources, some of which Dr. Rabiat-Akande referenced, especially Usul Siyasa of Mohammed Bello and several other political tracts of the Fodi Awa. The third historiographical tradition is the writings and the travel literature of the European explorers. But we also have the missionary historiography, which Dr. Rabiat-Akande extensively engaged in this particular book. And then we have the colonial service historiography. And then we also have the Euro-American academic historiography, the scholars that succeeded the colonial officers, some of whom actually even transitioned from being colonial officers to academics, in the case of people like Anthony Green. And then we also have the African academic historiography, and this is where Yusuf Bala Usman is coming from. But what I noticed and what I was really like yearning for and expecting in this book is the engagement with the Arabic and Islamic historical sources, and also the vernacular historical sources in Hausa language. These two historiographical schools were not present in this particular book. And here I'm talking about the works of scholars like Sheikh Abaka Gumi. Sheikh Abaka Gumi is the first, Grand Qadi of Northern Nigeria. And on the book treating Islamic law in Northern Nigeria, I would expect that Dr. Rabiat-Akande would extensively engage Sheikh Abaka Gumi, because Sheikh Abaka Gumi, he has a couple of writings on this subject of Islamic law and the transitioning of Northern Nigeria from this colonial modernity, transitioning from the Islamicate political structure to the colonial modernity. So I was expecting that Dr. Rabiat-Akande would engage some of the works of Sheikh Abaka Gumi, particularly the primary source materials of Abaka Gumi. But also, I was also expecting Sheikh Adam Ali Lori. Adam Ali Lori is one of those notable Muslim intellectuals who function not just as a Muslim cleric, but also as a historian. And he has a couple of writings on the same subject, particularly his work on Al-Islam Din wa Dawla, which Al-Islam Din wa Dawla is Islam, religion, and the state, where he also addressed this question of secularism. And he has another work titled Ukuku al-Insan, which is human rights. And in that work, Sheikh Adam Al-Ilori extensively critique the United Nations notion of human rights, or even this idea of human rights and the way it is tied to secularism. So I was expecting that voices of scholars like that would be present in this book. But also more recently, not well, Sheikh Ibrahim Saleh, who is considered the Grand Mufti of Nigeria presently, he has also written a couple of works on this subject. In fact, one of his work that I was hoping that Dr. Rabiat Akande would engage in this book is his Madu Kanaisi fi Garbi Ifokia, where he wrote about the Christian missions in West Africa, where he also engaged with some of this missionary historiography, questioning some of their premises and assumptions. And yeah, Ibrahim Saleh, he has another work which was recently published on sovereignty, sovereignty in and Islam in modern day political system, where he also addressed this question of secularism. And then lastly, Professor Alaro, Abdulrazak Alaro, who is at University of Ilorin, he has this book titled Tanasir for Kia, where he wrote about the Christian missions in West Africa, and he also engaged this question of Islamic law, because Professor Alaro himself is trained he's an expert in Islamic law, and he engaged this question of missionary and the intersection of missionizing, campaign, colonialism, and Islamic law. So I would, should in case
Yeah.
Dr. Rabiat Akonde plans to further research along this line, I think it's important. You know, when we talk about decolonization, we need to actually decenter like Eurocentric modes of thinking, or even Eurocentric scholarship in general. We need to actually relegate it to the background and privilege, voices from the Muslim sources, from the Muslim community. So we can't continue to write about Northern Nigeria if we are silencing, notable scholars from the region. Not necessarily silencing, because I know that's not Dr. Rabiat Akonde. I know her in person, and I know
Thank,
her
thank
scholarly
you,
orientation.
Abdul Basit.
Sorry.
Thank you, Abdul Basit. I think we have a very wonderful contributions. Maybe we'll allow Dr. Rabi, we are giving you some, maybe 10 to 15 minutes to respond. And before
we have
then,
Dr. Junaid.
Do we have any discussion around that
Yes,
we
we
have
have
no
Dr.
call on?
Junaid. Yes, Dr. Junaid is available here.
Is Dr. Junaidu around? Okay,
Yes.
please let us hear from Junaidu.
Okay. Very much, Chair and other discussants. Actually, this book by Dr. Rabiat is a very fascinating work, if I can say, because I learn a lot from it. And it's a very interesting work to me, and I'm very sure to many other readers, because the approach of the book using historical approach is very interesting, especially looking at the northern Nigeria is a very ideal place for a particular research on the issue of religion and secularism, particularly in Nigeria. And based on this, as a history student, I can say that the contestation about the religion in northern Nigeria started as early as around 11th century, when Islam was introduced, as contested between the Islam and traditional religions. And it goes beyond even during the jihad, when Islamization continued in northern Nigeria, including in other areas that were dominated by the non-Muslim, particularly in the Middle Belt, the so-called Middle Belt. And the focus of this book is talking about the colonial and post-colonial northern Nigeria, whereby when the colonial rule was established, especially at the earliest period, the Lugard was more interested about the religious harmony, if I can use the word. And that is why some missionaries were not happy with the policy introduced by the Lugard, which promoted the Islamization, or if you like, the introduction of Islam or in other areas in northern Nigeria. That was why immediately in the 1930s, when the Donald Cameron came in, he tried to change most of these policies that were started by Lugard. And one area that I'm very interested in is the argument of the book, particularly as some scholars argue that the marriage between Lugard and the emirs was just to promote Islam. But I can say that the marriage is more of a marriage of conveniences, because the colonial administrators, they need harmony in northern Nigeria, which will allow them for a stability and also to benefit from the local resources. And this is very interesting because there are some scholars that argue that the collaboration between the Lugard and the emirs was more to promote Islam, which I think it was not like that. It was more of a marriage of convenience between the colonial administrators and the emirs. And this contestation goes beyond colonial period as up to today. That is why I say that even during post-colonial period, this contestation continues up to today. Because if we look at when the Sharia was implemented, as argued in this book, that there were a lot of anticipations by the people on what Sharia could offer to the people. That was why there's a very interesting paper by late Professor Dahira about Sharia and the future of Nigeria. I don't know whether you have read the paper. It is a very interesting about the popular opinion or anticipation about the Sharia implementation in northern Nigeria. So my concern now with this is the fact that since we are talking about the Islam, about contestation, about religious movement in northern Nigeria, I think we need to go beyond Sharia implementation. Because when it was started in the 1999 in Zamfara and in 2000 in Kano, there are a lot of anticipation by people what Sharia could offer to the people. So what I want Dr. Rabiat to do now, to see what happened at least 20 years or 25 years after Sharia, how has that aspiration and aspiration by people were they met? And also we need to look at Sharia beyond the religion also, or Islam beyond contestation beyond religion, by saying that we also need to look at the political angle of it. Just recently during the 2023 election, the issue of Muslim ticket became a very serious issue in Nigeria. And look at the other angles, the major opponent, Peter Obi, also was also in the same religion in a secular state. So I think we need to look at what happened after implementation of the Sharia after 20 years, and also what about the political angle of it. Because in 2023, there was an attempt to conduct general national population census. The issue of religion was removed because religion is always sensitive in Nigeria. That was why intentionally it was removed from the major demographic consideration in the Nigerian population census. So I think also, as also mentioned by the chair, that this particular work you need to consider the subalterns, because you have a very rich sources. But if you look at in terms of the interviews, particularly by the local people, I think you need to do more on this, particularly looking at the major areas, both in the northern western part of Nigeria, and also in the middle belt and other areas in the northern eastern part of Nigeria. I think the opinion of the people will be very helpful in understanding their feeling about the Sharia and all this process of contestation that is going on between the religions and also between the political class. I think that is very brief comments that I can say about it. But the book is very interesting and it will help in understanding the history of Nigeria and also the African history generally. Thank you.
Thank you, Junaid. Thank you very much. At this point,
sorry?
Hello, you want to add?
Yes. I'm not sure if we have time for a second round, so it's better for me just put my questions here.
We are coming. We have time.
Okay.
I think we are terminating at 5:15. here in Nigeria. We still have time.
Okay, great. I'll wait.
So let's just give her 5 minutes to respond. Dr. Can she hear me?
Yes, she's coming to speak.
Is she?
Okay. Okay.
So Dr. Rabiat.
Okay.
You had.
Okay. I mean, I just want to start by thanking the organizers of LSA for inviting me, to Professor Adorito for inviting me to do this, and to thank all the panelists for agreeing to provide these incredibly rich comments. So thank you so much, Professor Bauer, for taking time out of your busy schedule. Thank you, Abdibasit. It would have been lovely to see you in person. I thought I was going to join via Zoom myself, but I happen to be in Lagos. Thank you, Zayan. Lovely to meet you, and thank you, of course. Thank you. I'm deeply, deeply grateful to you all for doing this and for providing these incredibly rich comments. Sabal said I have 10 minutes, so I cannot hope to respond to everything in 10 minutes. I'm just gonna make a couple of general comments that I hope will get the conversation going even further. So just a couple of comments as to why I wrote the book, because I think that sometimes like sort of getting a sense of where the author is coming from, places the book in a specific context, but that is not always obvious when produce a book, because obviously when you produce a book, it's no longer yours, it's out there in the world, and everyone takes from it, what relates to them, right? So they're saying that we read books as much as books read us, right? And so the comments that we provide on books and books of scholarship, are very much a reflection of our own thoughts and experiences and where we're coming from as well. And so I wanted to write this book because I was really, as an initial matter, just perplexed by just the increasing marginality of Africa in legal scholarship, right? So the idea that I was always in spaces where when law was spoken about, it was always spoken about in universal terms, even though, of course, it was Eurocentric, right? So law is universal, but that universality is very much situated in a specific Euro-American context. And so when we speak of the law of secularism and what ideas are global, or to use some word, what ideas are portable, what ideas we can learn from, it's always Euro-American, right? And so we can use those textbooks in Nigeria, but we can never learn, we can never teach the world about secularism in Nigeria as a universal idea. And so when we talk about Nigeria, or Africa, we always talk about a place. That's not law, right? That, at least in the places where I usually find myself. But when we speak about law, it's universal, but it's European and Eurocentric. And so as a graduate student then, and certainly as a law professor now, it's something that I find really perplexing. So I wanted to write a book in which I wanted to think about producing a history of secularism in a very local context that would show how that local context itself was reflective of global ideas, right? So again, to go back to some sort of the portability of the ideas that I want to produce in this book. And so to that extent, it had to be a local story that used the global language. And by that, I don't mean just the fact that it's in English, right? And so the ideas, the terms, and, we can learn from it, can they teach this as a constitutional law, course text in the global north? So this is sort of the colonial, ethos that motivated this project initially. And of course, as I was grappling with that, I was also grappling with just my own perplexity with what was then, so in 1999, which was when I was in college, right, the old, Sharia debate, right? So is Nigeria a secular state, as Abdul Basit put it? And everyone on both sides of the debate was invoking the past, but we're invoking the past in very different, terms. And so it was clear to me that, there's something about secularism in Nigeria, and history had something to do with it. It wasn't clear. But it was also, obviously by then, to go back to Sam's point, a global, what was beginning to emerge as a global critical, history / theory of secularism. But that scholarship also ignored Black Africa, right? So, Egypt was there, North Africa was there, the Middle East was there. But even in that discourse, right? So, Black Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa was always marginal. And I recall going to a conference one at UC Berkeley, right, where, all these folks were presented. I was, still much in my earlier years in Berkeley, so I was not presenting. I was just attending as an attendee, and I was sort of trying to talk about what I was sort of learning from my own archival sources, and there was just it was, sort of like the subalterns cannot speak, like it was like no one was hearing me in a sense, and so this sense of the compounded marginality of Black Africa, right? So in writings on Islam, right? Islam in Africa is marginalized. In writings on law, Africa is marginalized. And so that decolonial ethos, right, spurred me to write this project. And that's very much, I think, apparent in, in the move to both, deeply engage with my sources and to pay homage to local voices who are writing on the subject, while also insisting that this is a global story, right? And it's a story in which we can put this, the narrative of Northern Nigeria alongside with global stories of secularism, right? And we can, they too can learn from us. So that's, and obviously when one does that sort of work, there's always a tension, right? Historians, so Sam is historian in the room, right? So there are always, those tensions of, what you gain and what you lose, right? What you decenter, right? What you silence, right? Or what you mute a little to make certain things, certain voices, much more legible. And I think this is suddenly obvious, in the dance that I do in different chapters of the book. So in some chapters, the global narrative is really, really strong, right? And the local voices are more muted. And in some others, the local voices, seem to muted. And this goes to Abubak's question and, engaging with local scholars. So this was very much what was going on for me as I was trying to, to really, make that fine balance, insisting that this is a global story, even as I wanted to pay to local voices. But you're absolutely right to point out those other sources that might have taken up more space. So I think, maybe I could have done more with Gumi than I did. I wanted to really think about, him and, and Haliru Binji as they're looking back at the 1958 deal, right? So these were the big jurists at the time, right? How are they responding to it, right? So how are they remembering history? How are they constructing what Islamic law was or what it ought to be? But I wanted to think of what they were doing, not just in terms of their primary writings and what they thought of as the law, right? As they read. I also wanted to think of how they were responding, right? And so that this is where, those interviews conducted of them at the time was so important to me, and how they were responding in real time, how they were engaging. And so it's not just a story of the law as jurists think of it to be. It's a story of how jurists are made and how jurists digest what they are and what their place in the world is changes over time. And that it influenced what sort of sources I privilege and what and what's what not just in terms of the sources, in terms of, by which I mean now the characters, but also in terms of which of their works was more important to me as I was writing this story. Do I have more time to make a couple of more comments before we go for another one?
Yes.
First of all, do I have
you
more time? Okay.
You can give me more 5 minutes.
Okay.
We'll go for the second round later.
Okay. So on the point that Abbasid made about decolonization, right? About So going back to the question of sources, so I responded to that in terms of, the writing of the book, right? The question of, historiography and the writing of history and why we choose certain sources and the tensions with that. But there's also sort of the broader question of the ethics of, of assuming a posture of decolonization when we write, right? And what we see. And so, sometimes I tell myself, well, I certainly write this, with a decolonial mindset, as I explained, but I say, well, this is not a book on decolonization. This is a book on colonialism, right? Because, I tell myself, like, I don't even know that we're there yet. And I just recently wrote a review of Sam's, fantastic new book on militarism in Africa. And sort of in my final few lines, I was like, this is the book that provokes answer. There's a lot of anxieties, right? But what is decolonization, right? It's very messy. It's very contested. As Sam says in his book, it's an otherwise, but there are different kinds of otherwise, right? There are different paths that might have been taken or that we might take. And I mean, in a recent article that I just wrapped up and that I have coming up, I represent one of the chapters in the book, the one in which colonial, government empaneled jurists and legal elites and asked them to travel to Libya and to Pakistan and Sudan and to figure out what it means to be Muslim and modern, right? And I tell that story in a particular way in the book as a chapter, right? I tell it as a story of part of the making of 1958, independence deal, right? And one that was already, predetermined. I present that book. I present that chapter, in the article as a story of, thwarting what might have been, as a story that thwarted a certain vision of what decolonization might have been. And I said, well, I don't know what that might have been. I know that there might have been another path. I think that path might have been marked if local elites and Jews had actually sat down and had a frank conversation about what the role of Islam, and other religion ought to be in the state, right? What ought to be, the constitutional relationship, right, between the state and religion. That might have, would that have led to a better outcome than what I present in the book? I mean, we don't know. So that's the point, right? About writing history, like we wouldn't know. I mean, we want to believe that we would have done it better, and I certainly want to believe that, and I always say that, but we don't know. I mean, the question is, well, will we do it better? Will we get a chance to do it better? And that's a question that is obviously very live now today, given everything that's going on in the world. We know that colonialism is what we don't want, and imperialism is, is really, what we don't want and what we ought to always, be resisting. But the business of decolonization, right? And this is, again, I say, I don't do that work at all here. This is about colonialism. I say, well, if you want to learn about decolonization in a certain form, read Sam's book. That's a very messy thing. So I'm just going to stop there and then, see if folks have another round of questions.
Yeah, thank you, Rabiat. But you have not responded to what I and Junaidu
yes,
commented on your subaltern approach. You have decided to sideline the voices of the less privileged.
I'm going to respond.
Yes.
I am, because this came up, this has come up. This comes up for me over and over again. So this is my nemesis, right? In this way, everyone asks me. I think that I think it's so I'm very aware of it. It's I mean, there are different ways of writing legal history, but it's not uncommon that work certainly by legal scholars, not necessarily legal historians, have that shortcoming, right? In that when we think about mapping legal discussion, legal debates, and think about how they evolve over time, we tend to privilege elite voices. I mean, should that necessarily be the case? No, I don't think so. I mean, in the context of this book, I usually think that, well, one very easy way, I mean, because I was not doing, it's a book in which my, the extent of my focus after independence is the 1977 conference. And I really just wanted to zoom in on the conference and not, do more than that again. Because I always insist again, it's a book on colonialism and not a book on post-colonialism. And so to look at those subaltern voices in the pre-colonial years, would mean, beyond, mapping, media debates, right? Which I do, but again, those are also elite voices, right? Because who are those writing, Garcia, those were, these were political elites. One is, would have been to look into the sort of arguments that, our people's brought before courts were making, right? And so when I present some of the court cases, the question is, what were the arguments that were being made? I could have used those, but I was very suspicious of the court records. I wasn't convinced that the sort of arguments that were being, that the records that was being presented by the court were not already so mediated that I was actually not hearing the voices of the subalterns. And so I decided, I was just not sure I was actually getting something different from it, because it was too close to the elite voice that I really doubted. And so, for instance, when I talk about the cases in which the colonial state decided to eliminate a D as an option, in cases of of unlawful killing, when people would come to court and they would make arguments, is it, so to use the example of Asana, one of the cases that I used, was that actually what she was saying? Is that actually what's recorded on the face of the records? I'm very suspicious, because it's already recorded, right? She's not the one writing. I really worry about what's already lost. But I mean, one of the things I say is, well, maybe an anthropologist, would do a much better job. And again, obviously, when we write, it's, I hope that, other much more brilliant folks, right, would come along and, and unearth much more interesting material and be able to actually, dive deep and actually unearth these voices and build up on this work. So that's my hope.
Thank you, Dr. Rabiat. Thank you for that response. Can we go for the second round? We are giving 1 minute to Deng. I think Deng wanted to say something.
Yes, thank you. A second point that I also want to continue from my previous one is that I was also fascinated by the transnational or global connection that this book has traced. It talked about how Christian missionaries promoted religious liberty into the Article 18 of the United Nations Declaration, and also how this how the article was domesticated into Nigerian constitution. And also another point that also Professor Akande mentioned earlier was about a trip to Sudan, to Pakistan, to learn, to see how the Islamic law was connected to, was compatible to the modern state. So I want to push a little bit further on this global or transnational, translocal connections in a different angle. I was wondering, because you mentioned a little bit about the Yoruba Muslims, their participation in the debates about constitution debates in the 77, but I was wondering what's the opinion of what are the participations of the Yoruba Muslims in the early debates in the constitutions or in the later colonial period of the Penal Code in the 1958. And also I found some archival materials during my research about the idea that in the late colonial period there was some connections or there are communications between French colonial government and British colonial government in West Africa, talking about Muslim educations and other topics. I was wondering, because the secularism in France and the secularism in the British Empire was kind of different genealogies or the different forms of secularism. So I was wondering if there was if you did you notice any connections or communications, dialogues between French colonialists and British colonialists on the topic of secularism or the topic of how to regulate Muslim affairs, or the differences of the religious differences. And maybe the last question is about how you mentioned a little bit towards the end of the article. You talked about the consequences of this hierarchizing religious differences is the creation of inequality. So moving forward, I think my question also related to Junaid's question. So moving forward at the present, how do you see to solve this kind of inequality created by the colonial and post-colonial states in the form of debates of secular and religious? Yeah. My question. Thank you.
Is there anybody that wants to ask? Dr. Rabiat, I think I have two more contributions I want to make. For further research, I don't know, the book has already been published. One, I discover you rely so much on Protestants when you are talking about the CMS, the Christian sources, forgetting about the African churches. So we are indigenous, we are Africans. So we also look at those sources that has to do with our African churches because it was a resistance movement. The Africans resisted the missionary churches, which they felt during the colonial period that they have not been incorporated. They have been marginalized, and that led to resistance to break away by the emergence of African churches. So we need to incorporate. Sorry. In another way, again, the post-colonial period, if you may need to further your studies or your publications on that angle, the gender perspective, with the implementation of Sharia, in 1999, in most of these northern states, women came out to speak their voice, especially the Form 1. So in that angle, we also need to see the position of those voices. A gender voice should be given when next you are going to expand. So I think we have a very wonderful. You want to add, Abdul Basit?
Yes. Okay. I think I will go after Sam. Dr. Daly. Dr. Daly.
Okay, thanks. Just to add one little thing, I think one of the innovations of this book that maybe isn't clear to those who are not in the legal world is how it speaks back to a decolonial legal scholarship that I think has gotten a lot of things wrong and that Akande really gets right. So it is true that this is a book about colonialism, not about what comes after, but nonetheless, people have asked a lot about the decolonial view, and so it's worth taking those critiques seriously. But in defense of Akande, there are people who have taken that approach, people like Roberto Unger or Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who have completely misconstrued what worked, how colonial law worked in the course of their critique of it. Akande does something very different in that she goes into the finer points of how this legal system worked without endorsing them. I mean, there is no endorsement of Lugard or Cameron or any of the other British philosophers of colonial administration who are talked about in this book, but she takes their thought seriously and therefore is able to understand it in a much more nuanced way than the Ungers and Santos of the world. I think that is important to note. There's a kind of nostalgia that is embedded in a lot of decolonial critiques of this era and out of the history that Akande is describing. And she has none of that nostalgia, which I think is really notable or noteworthy. She is just describing this system for its own sake. And that is really important if you're going to try to understand how the Nigerian state works in the present. That's not a question, but just more a kind of a defense, I think, of this important tactic that she takes, strategy that she takes.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so I'll make this brief. I'll make this brief first by reiterating my previous point. Dr. Akande, even though I've not met you, you're someone who you've been you have been an inspiration for my own scholarship and the current book I'm writing. And I do understand the philosophical orientation, the epistemology, ontology shaping your work, and I have deep respect for your work. But I also know the fact that you have privilege. You are a particular institution, you have voice, a chair, and for African scholars in Western academy, I actually think it's uh, our duty to make sure that we are using the platform, the privilege we have to showcase and balance the work of indigenous scholars, and not replicate this citational praxis and citational hegemony of the works of European or scholars who are trained in the Western canon, because over time, their voices have actually been the dominant voice in the academic literature. And I think the new generation of scholars now who are now in the spaces where you are, I think our duty for the world to know more about the work of Amadou, more about the works of Ali Rubinji, in a way that they could also be their works could be canonized and be raised to the pedestal. People like Foucault or Anna Arendt and all of these other scholars. Because to be honest, there's nothing new that those scholars are saying that our own local or indigenous scholars are also not saying. The only difference is that they don't have advocates and ambassadors like the Foucaults of the world or the Anna Arendt of the world. So it's also a way of telling you that you can actually do more, and we have a lot of expectation for you. The other thing I would love to briefly mention as well, with regards to your book, should in case you plan to further write something on this subject, I think it's also important to look at the construction of the Maliki law. So I know that in the course of your work, you must have engaged Patricia Caroline Gloucester's dissertation on the evolution of Maliki law in northern Nigeria from 1930 to 1960. Because in this conversation about Islamic law, the West African Muslim space is centered on the Ash'ari creed, the Maliki madhab, and the Sufi tariqah. That's why the scholars in their manuscript, you will see them saying they will write Ash'ari itiqadan, that their creed is Ash'ari, Maliki madhaban, that they are Maliki in their madhab, and then they belong to any of the Sufi tariq, tariqah, either Tijaniya, Qadriya, and several other tariqah. Now, this Maliki madhab, what exactly does it really constitute? And what are also some of the continuity and changes even within this? Because this Maliki law or the Maliki madhab was also part of this colonial enterprise, and the colonial enterprise had to engage the Maliki canon itself. And that engagement, I think, is also something to probe. And lastly, so you mentioned like the local Muslim political elites who were supported by the colonial administration, and they were they were funded to go to places like Pakistan, Sudan in order to learn the legal. Now, some of these local elites, the likes of Waziri Junaid, particularly the Wali of Kasina, Alhaji Muhammad Bello, Malam Ali Binji that you mentioned, Abdul Malik Bapa Mahmood, who is the Qadi of Jihar Bauchi of Bauchi State, Al-Khali Baba Kura Imam, as well as Al-Khali of Kasina, Alhaji Muhammadu Dodo. All of these people, they all have writings. In fact, Waziri Junaid, he has a collection of Rihla that he wrote about his Rihla to Agadez, his Rihla to Jerusalem, his Rihla to Iraq, even his Rihla to Sudan and Pakistan. It's also important because what we understood about the writings of this or the ideas of these figures mostly came from Philip Austin, the Sharia implementation of work, or the works of other colonial of other Euro-American scholars like Alan Christolo and several other scholars, Guna, who wrote about Islamic law, and Sarah El-Tantawi. But it's also important for us to engage the work of the scholars themselves and unearth their voices. And one way to unearth their voices is also to look at the newspaper the periodicals, because all of these figures, they were writing in Gaskatafi Kwabo, which was the major Nigerian newspaper. In fact, Waziri Junaid, Ali Obinji, including Abaka Gumi, they all have columns. And Naibi Sulema Al-Wali, they all have column in Gaskatafi Kobo in this local Hausa newspapers published by Gaska Corporation, where they were writing about their views. So it's important that we should not just depend on what other people are saying about them, but to also hear what they themselves are saying, because sometimes there could be discrepancy. I would love to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdulbasi. We'll call on Dr. ReaderSakande to maybe give us a response to some of the comments.
I just want to be sure we're able to take questions from the room with you.
Okay.
Professor Bauer, I'm gonna respond quickly, but I want to be sure we can take questions from the room as well.
Yes.
If people have questions.
Do we have questions from the audience?
Next questions. Okay, I'll start. Any more questions? Just indicate. Follow-up questions and some new questions. So the question on the transnational dimension of the story, and how the Nigerian struggles surprisingly influenced. I mean, surprisingly for those who would be surprised that that Nigerian that happened actually influenced global legal institutions. But how all those debates that I map in the book influenced the making of Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which legal scholars now think of as being the paradigmatic encapsulation of the modern idea of religious liberty, right? So I tell that story in the book, and so the question is it's trying to get a sense of whether some of the voices that came in 1977 were also involved in those earlier debates. So am I sure? Am I right that that's the question? Okay. So the sources would reveal that the struggles only nationalized in the way in which it did in 1977. It only became framed as a national legal issue, a national constitutional issue, right? The first, the first post-independence national conference in 1967. So this goes back to the question that I posed earlier, right? About whether things might have been different if we had, if colonialism had not happened, or maybe it had happened differently, or if it had ended differently. I mean, the question is, well, might the question have been raised at that question of religious liberty, being centered in the way in which it was in 1977, during the debates that led to the 1960 so during the 1958 London Conference, during the series of discussions that led to the 1960 Constitution. I mean, it's not clear. So for sure, Article 18 of the Universal Declaration was debated as a proposition, and it was ultimately accepted through the series of devices that I described in the book. So I described, for those who have not read the book, I described how an incredibly powerful global ecumenical group that had lots of influence in the colonial office in London essentially got this Article 18 domesticated, right? I showed how the major opposition to the article came from Nigeria, because again, this was seen as a northern Nigerian issue, and as in fact, as it played out at the set of constitutional conference, although it was a national constitutional conference, it was very clear, right, that this question of religious liberty, this question of what role religion is going to have in the state, was one that was particularly for the Northern Nigerian. So the Northern Nigerian debate became nationalized in 1960 during, in 1958 during a series of debates that led to the Constitutional Conference. But that debate actually did not play out in the way in which it did in 1977, right? In that the Muslim, Christian line at that time, right, was not in the way in which we once saw the alignment in 1977. 1977 was the point that I showed in which the Muslim Christian became national for the first time. That did not happen in 1966. Really, 1958 debate led to 1960 Constitution. In fact, at the time, one saw that the vocal opposition to Article 18, provision of religious liberty, was actually from Northern Muslim elites as opposed to national. So that I just do not see how Yoruba Muslims were involved in very vocal. That it's not obvious on the face of the records. I mean, the point, your second point, which goes back to Dr. G01's point, which I did not respond to earlier, or question about, how do we move forward? What next? I mean, again, as I mentioned earlier, I always say, well, this is a book on colonialism. I'm a legal historian, so I always wear two hats, of course. So I'm a legal historian, but I'm also a legal scholar, and so as a legal scholar, I should say, well, lawyers, design institutions, and we have answers to these questions, and I should have an answer as a constitutional lawyer. Legal historians are more skeptical, right? So we want to understand what happened, right? We say, well, we don't have answers. We just want to understand, what happened. We want to understand how legal ideas, and debates and struggles travel over time. I mean, to the extent that I will say anything on that point that is, as normative as it could be, I would say, well, I mean, at the very least, I think what needs to happen, right, is for, the peoples in the state to actually sit down and renegotiate the terms of their union. I think that's actually what the crux of the issue in Nigeria is, right? The fact that we're still having these debates, right? This debate that we're not actually sitting down to have. We're still having the debate, in public discourse. We're still having the debate over what it means to actually be a state, right? What it means to be constituted as a people, as a nation, right? So I think what needs to actually happen is for us to actually sit down and negotiate and maybe renegotiate the terms of our union. And that's as prescriptive, as normative as I'll go on this point. First of all, I really, really appreciate those pointers for future research. These are so, so important. You're absolutely right. The gender perspective, right? So if one was doing this as a work that focuses on the post-colonial period, the gender perspective is so crucial, right? So you mentioned Form 1 and it being a major voice in the debates post-1999, especially, and I completely agree, that's incredibly important and a very, very important voice, to grapple with. And I said, you're right, the construction of Maliki law, right? That would be a really, fascinating project to do. So, Patricia Gloucester, she did her thing, but I mean, something much more comprehensive needs to be done. But also, I mean, the question is, well, what does it mean to actually, call the Maliki law, right? What is that, right? Is it law in the sense in which we think about law? Because I mean, when we think about law, to go back to the point I made at the beginning, when I first began to respond, right? Sort of the global consciousness, think about law in a very sort of Euro-American sense of the term, even while we think of it as law. So law tends to be something, for the most part, that is codified. It's easily discoverable. It's certain, right? There's no, at least in the law. I mean, we might say, well, when it comes to what courts do, right? Courts might disagree, but ultimately we still have a hierarchy where we have a Supreme Court. We have precedents. But when we think about law, we think about it as being, for the most part, codified, easily discoverable, certain, uniform. That's not what Islamic jurisprudence is, as you know, right? As scholars of Islamic law know, right? To think about fiqh is to understand, as a basic matter that, scholars, the fuqaha, understand that what they're doing is an attempt to expound on the Sharia, right? God's law, right? And it's, the Sharia as God's law is not knowable in its entirety, right? So we can try, and scholars would agree on the fundamentals. If scholars are historically agreed on the fundamentals, but scholars also have disagreed on particular matters, right? And they understand, right? So to go back to saying that, well, if you try as a scholar to get to to expound on law, as a jurist, you try to in expounding on fiqh, you try, but you know that you might get it wrong, right? So if you try and get it wrong, you get one reward. If you try and get it right, well, then you get two rewards. But we don't actually know, and that's precisely the point where they're different, madahib, and they have different approaches to certain matters. Again, the fundamentals, fundamental theological matters, all schools agree on, but there are real juristic matters in which there's difference of opinion. But even within the Maliki madhab itself, there are different opinions on different matters, right? So to think about Maliki fiqh, Maliki jurisprudence as law is actually to misunderstand what it is, right? To actually bring in some of the baggage, right, of European law, right? And what European law means, it's actually to erase the diversity that was always very fundamental to scholars, Muslim scholars, Islamic jurists' understanding of what their task was and what they do. And so it would be really interesting to understand what it actually means to think of Maliki law and what it meant for the colonial state to say, well, although Maliki law, Maliki jurisprudence, even I am saying Maliki law, right? That Maliki jurisprudence, was predominant in colonial era, that we're now legislating Maliki law as Islamic law. Right? So what did that mean, right? What did that mean to do that? But also, as the colonial state did, what did it mean to actually legislate, right, a particular understanding of Maliki law? So as I noted in the book, a colonial official had said, well, actually, what we would, if we wanted to understand what Maliki law was, we would simply open Sidi Khalil's, translation, or the French translation of, sorry, we will simply open, Rookstein's English translation of the French translation of Sidi Khalil's, work, which is just a very specific, expression of Maliki law. And so what did it mean to actually think about law in that sense? And of course, colonial officials did that because they were coming from a tradition in which, if you wanted to understand the laws of England, right, you just had to open a certain text, and that's what it was. So you didn't have to actually engage with multiple, opinions. And so what actually was lost in that process? And so I think it would be a very, very fascinating work that could actually do the work of understanding what Maliki jurisprudence, what Maliki fiqh was, and then what it meant to actually think, to think of Maliki law, right, as a distinct thing, as a form of transformation of Maliki law, of Maliki fiqh itself. I think that's all from the most recent set of questions. Sam, yours was more of a comment, so I don't have anything to say in response to that. But do you have any questions or comments?
Can we have questions or this? Any comment? No comments? We are expected to end this session by 5:15. I think we have 10 minutes more. We have 10 minutes more. So what are we going to do?
I have a follow-up.
You have a question?
A follow-up comment, not a question. It's a comment.
Okay, follow-up. It's okay. Go ahead.
Yes. Thank you so much once again, Professor Bawa, and thank you so much, Dr. Akande. So, Dr. Akande, from what I understand about your work, especially this first book and your other projects that you've been working on, African legal history, the pre-colonial African legal history, and others. I just want Sheikh Adam Alilori. I want to recommend that you should really dig deep into his archive, his body of writings, because he's one scholar who especially in this aspect of law, of legal history. He's one scholar who has a couple of writings. One famous one that I have. Sorry?
Dr. Akande, are you saying so? Are you responding? Dr. Akande?
Yes, I'm trying to.
Hello? You are trying to. Can you go ahead? Can you continue? Rabiat.
Yes. Yeah.
Can you continue the floor so you can continue?
Because can you hear me?
So
It's not the net. It's terrible.
Yes.
That's what it's terrible.
Can you hear you now?
I hear you.
It's freezing. Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
So I
Yes.
was saying that I missed some of your comments, and I would appreciate you if you could email the references as well.
Okay, I will definitely talk with you, inshallah. Jazakallah khairan.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
And I completely hear your point. I completely hear you, Abdulbasit, your points about decolonization and citations. Yes, I hear you.
Yeah, to build on Dr. Abdulbasit, Dr. Rabiat. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Up on that point, I think the best way is I appreciate the fact that we have scholars in that area, which I think Dr. Abdulbasit is trying to draw your attention on the way in which we promote our own local scholars. Relying heavily on Western scholars is doing a lot of damage to our own narration, because we all know we come from even our history. Our history was not really written about us. We have to now engage in writing and narrating our perspectives on history. To avoid that, you have the opportunity in living outside the country, try to engage in our resources. We have a lot of resources, both oral and written sources when you want to write about Northern Nigeria. So I think if we don't have any,
I think we have a question from the audience online.
we have it online. Can you go through online, Dr. Akande, and then respond? Let's see what we have. I didn't see any question.
Someone raised his hand. Sulaiman.
Suleiman?
Yes, in the audience.
Okay. Are you sure not a mistake?
I'm not sure.
You're not sure. Yes. Sikiru. Are you sure we don't have questions?
Yes, we have.
We have a question. So if we don't have any question, we just have 5 minutes. And where I am, the power is off. You can see Nigeria for you. Yes, the light has gone off.
I have a
can I use the question?
Okay. Yeah.
No, but I think you can go ahead, Sam, to ask. I think you
Okay.
can go ahead, Sam, to ask your question because the part is possibly Dr. Rabiat will still be able to see the recording.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, my question is what Rabiat is working on now. You set yourself up for you really changed the way that I think I and a lot of other people think about colonial law. And I'm wondering what is next? What is the aspect of colonial legalism that you're exploring next? Or are you moving into another area, maybe even one that isn't about Nigeria? Because, as I said, uh, I think you have an ability to speak to questions that are not particular to Nigerian history in a way that is very distinct. And I'm curious, where you get this insight next. But so that we're going to be able to
Let's first listen to some.
answer that tech-wise. So we'll
Dr.
talk another
Rabiat,
time.
are you with him? Dr. Rabiat, are you hearing Sam?
I heard parts of it. It's very choppy for us now, but I heard parts of it. What next? So I mean, I think Abdulbasit has some idea what I've been up to recently. So so my work has actually I've sort of taken a step back in two different directions. So one is in thinking about a project that Abdulbasit mentioned earlier, the pre-colonial. So I'm working on a pre-colonial international legal of Africa project, right? So in which I'm editing a volume in which I brought together a couple of scholars, so lawyers, theologians, historians, political scientists, in which we are trying to recover and tell ideas, legal ideas of the international in pre-colonial Africa, right? And so, going to go back to the colonial, it was that, that motivated me to write this project. So, to sort of respond to the idea that, well, so I'm going to give a very concrete example. So when debates are made internationally, for instance, about reparations for slavery, right? The question that usually arises is, well, slavery was not transatlantic slavery, that is, because there were different kinds of slavery, that transatlantic slavery was not unlawful. So this is the argument. That transatlantic slavery was not unlawful at the time when it occurred, because it was not unlawful in Europe. And so the question is, well, were there other ideas of international law at the time? Were there African ideas of international law in which transatlantic slavery would have been unlawful, right? So this is actually one of the concrete ideas that motivates this project, right? In which we're trying to, rediscover these ideas and to tell these stories. And we are actually hoping that these would be ideas that can be used in international. And so that in that sense, I'm looking at colonialism by actually thinking about what came before, right? Can we, recover our histories, right, beyond colonialism, right? Can we tell the story of ourselves outside of the colonial encounter? Obviously, this is a project that is itself motivated by the colonial encounter. So there are questions about that. So that's a broader, very long-term research project that I'm working on, and in which, we have a book for them coming out in the next couple of months. And the next project is also a project about periodizing colonialism, right? So the first goes to the before, right? What came before? But the second is actually, so this is an individual project in which I'm actually looking at the period of decolonization, and I'm looking at ideas of and otherwise, right? What are other paths that I mean? What are other modes of legal, of world organization? What does it mean to actually decolonize, right? So it was clear, by the 60s, right? So 1960 was, the year of decolonizing. It was the year of Africa, right? So many African states are decolonizing, but it was also clear that colonialism was far from over, right? And there were these ideas about, well, what it actually meant to reorganize, what it actually meant to move beyond colonialism. not just for Africa, but also for the African diaspora, for Black.
Dr. Rabiat,
Yes.
Can you move faster because another session will soon start?
I know. I'm gonna conclude by saying that. So that project is one in which I am following Malcolm X as it travels across Africa in the 60s and encounters African leaders, and they're debating these ideas about what it actually means to reimagine the world, what it means to reimagine the world in which Africans, both in Africa and Africans in the diaspora, can actually imagine in an otherwise way, right? What it actually means to move beyond colonialism and slavery. I'm sorry I can't, there's no time to respond to the question in the chat, but I hope that, I can perhaps engage with the question at some other time. But thank you so much to Professor Bauer. Thank you to you, Zayan. Thank you, Sam. Thank you,
yes. Thank you,
Thank you for
LSA.
this
We want to
wonderful
appreciate.
book.
I'm so grateful.
We want to appreciate LSA and the author for giving us this opportunity for this discussion. Thank you very much. Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
I wish you all the best.
All right,
Yes,
thanks.
bye-bye.
Nice to see you.
Thank you, Professor.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor Bauer. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So you have a buffer, you have 15 minutes. So you go. Thanks.